Today's program, we're really happy to have two folks from Cpps, which is the Center for Personal Protection and Safety. Their topic is going to be a tipping point, keys to develop and implementing a comprehensive violence prevention program. The two gentlemen that will be joining us are Randy Spivey, who is the CEO and founder of Cpps, and Dan Graber, the Vice President of Faith-Based Initiatives. Randy, the founder, is the recognized leading expert in the field of preventing and responding to violence in the workplace, schools, and houses of worship. He has served in the Department of Defense and managed and provided oversight to hostage survival training programs in the Department of Defense and provided direct instruction to elite U.S. military units, including Delta Force and SEAL Team 6. Randy was appointed to the Department of Homeland Security Faith-Based Security Advisory Council in 2020, and he's worked with many national level media organizations. The full bios are on the invitation you got, so I'm just touching on them. Our next person that's our next guest with us today is Dan Graber, the Vice President of Faith-Based Initiatives at Cpps. Dan is the Vice President of this organization. He has over 30 years in training and management and spent much of that time traveling to over 95% of the U.S. and 25 other countries, training key personnel on everything from visual technologies to personal defense. Dan is a seasoned professional trainer and has had a whole lot of experience in training as a master instructor and trainer of trainers in the firearms industry. So both of these individuals have a tremendous wealth of knowledge. We look forward to what they have to say. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dan. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Doug. Greetings from everybody from the Center for Personal Protection and Safety. We're honored to be here. We certainly thank the Counter Threat Group for inviting us and asking us to be here and address such an important subject. I think it almost bears a cliche anymore to say the world that we live in is certainly changing every day. It is a dynamic society, and we are more than happy to talk with everyone today about these particular subjects. Randy, why don't you start us out as CEO and founder of the company? Why don't you go ahead and start us out with where Cpps has come from and how we were founded and what I consider to be one of your most interesting stories about how you needed to deal with an active shooter threat for your children one time.
Sure. Well, thank you, Dan and Doug and Rick. We appreciate the invitation to come and visit with your folks, and I appreciate you adjusting the time. I'm out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean right now, so it's just turned 6 o'clock in the morning here. So if you see a little bright sun coming up in the background, that's coming out of here in Hawaii. But yeah, we got in this business. As Doug mentioned, I used to work in the Department of Defense and training folks how to deal with crises. Particularly kidnapping or being detained by a foreign government. And so after 9/11, I thought to myself, there's a lot of folks at risk of being taken hostage or kidnapped in today's world environment, especially post 9/11, than just the military. And so we formed the company about 20 years ago. And our focus initially was on just high risk travel, kidnap survival. And we did that for a few years. But then when the Virginia Tech shooting happened, it's kind of interesting. You say certain words and people know exactly what you're talking about. Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, Columbine, Parkland. They immediately have a visual understanding of a really bad incident that happened. And after Virginia Tech happened, I remember watching the after action reports and the shooter, he walked into one of the classrooms and he shot a couple of the kids, and then he left that classroom for about 2 minutes. Well, we knew from doing the training in the military that a typical reaction to an extreme violence situation like that, if you've had no training, is to be startled, to be frozen in fear, or just react. Well, that's what these kids did. And so that shooter, 2 minutes after he shot a few of them, he comes back in that classroom, and guess where the kids are? They're sitting on the floor holding on to each other, frozen in fear. And then guess what he did? He just walked around and killed 6 more. And so when I saw that, I said to myself, we know you can train people to be able to respond in a crisis. In fact, the research we had done in the military was about 10% of people in a crisis without training are going to respond effectively. about 10% of people with training are going to mess it up. But it's that 80% in the middle that training and education really makes the difference in how people respond in the crisis. And so after seeing that, I said, you know, people were talking about law enforcement response, they were talking about gun control, they were talking about mental health issues, but nobody was talking about what do you do if you're that faculty member or that student in that classroom when somebody comes in with a gun. And so what we did at CPPS was we formed a team of former FBI hostage negotiator, head of behavioral analysis unit, and some other DoD members to put out a program called Shots Fired. And that became the first training or guidance in the US on how to effectively respond to an active shooter situation. And so because we were the first ones to put it out, it became policy. So the run, hide, fight vernacular that came out of this video, in fact, the FBI actually licensed that video and it became mandatory training for everybody, all 35,000 people in the FBI, because there was nothing else out there at the time. And so, you know, we had taken some of the training and the understanding of how to respond, say, in a hostage or kidnap situation, but then we had to think through it through the lens of an active shooter. And it turns out really what you would do in a hostage situation is about 180 degrees different from what you would do in an active shooter, and vice versa. And so that's what led us to getting into this training. And because we were the first ones to put this out, ASIS, you know, largest security trade association in the world, asked us to do a 2-day workshop out in Las Vegas back in 2007 on active shooter. It was the first one ever done in the country. And what Dan was referring to, and you know, talk about you know, crazy timing, but this was the first active shooter training workshop in the country. And we're down there in Las Vegas, and I just finished the introduction. And I sat down and I get a text message from my son, Josh, who was a junior in high school at the time. And the text message, no kidding, it said, Dad, there's a shooter in the school. What should I do? Should I run? So you got kids, you can imagine, you know, the irony of it, number one, and then just the pure shock of it. First, I thought he was kidding, a bad joke. And I said, are you serious? He goes, no, Dad, there's a shooter. What should I do? Should I run? So, you know, at first I'm in denial, but then I said, I better start talking to him. So I'm texting him back and forth. And I said, well, what do you see? What do you hear? I said, what's happening? I said, whatever you do, don't just sit there and get shot. So as I'm texting him back and forth, I get another message from my older son, David, who was a senior at the same school. He says the exact same thing. He says, Dad, there's a shooter in the school. What should I do? Should I run? And then I'm telling, so now I'm playing, you know, command post from Las Vegas to Spokane, Washington, where they were going into school. And then all the texting stopped. It went silent. So you can imagine what's going through my head as I trying to figure out what's going on with my kids 1,000 miles away. And what it turned out to be was they had a student that put on a clown mask, and he ran into one of the classrooms. He jumped in front of one of the teachers, and he pointed at her with his finger like a gun. He said, bang, bang, I've been hired to kill you, and now you're dead. And then he goes running out of the classroom. Well, you know, this teacher didn't know who he was. She has a total meltdown. They put the school into lockdown, and they search the school, and they find this kid outside, and he goes, oh, sorry, it's just a bad joke. But, you know, I didn't know that. As far as I knew, what we were teaching now was actually going down live with my kids. And so, you know, fast forward to kind of the end of this presentation, what it highlighted was, number one, that not only the need to educate people on how to respond, but how this could happen to anybody. In fact, I told that story to people, probably tens of thousands of people in live audiences over the last 10, 15 years. And I've had letters and people that were sitting in the audience who went home and talked to their kids. And then they had their kids were involved in an active shooter situation at college or university. And they come back and say, thank you so much, because we had a frame of reference to have that conversation. And it really sets the stage for what we're going to talk about today. And that when we talk about preventing violence, this isn't just a workplace violence issue. This isn't just an inner city issue for, you know, guns. This is a societal issue that permeates our entire country. And in some ways, when you talk about violence, it's not just gun oriented, but violence as a whole, it permeates the entire globe, particularly as we're coming out of COVID and lockdowns and, you know, crises politically and just a lot of stressors that I'll talk about in a minute. But it's a societal issue. And so what that means is that if you are representing houses of worship or churches, the church now can actually become a venue to educate people so they're not in that untrained category. And in fact, when they do it effectively, they actually become an empowering agent to the people that don't only work in the church, not only the volunteers in the church, but those that are sitting in the pews or seats on Sunday morning. Because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build resiliency on an individual level. So the church is one channel to be able to do that. The workplace is another. So obviously workplace violence is a big deal, and the same principles that would apply in the workplace would apply for anybody if you're out at a restaurant or a movie theater and somebody walks in with a gun. Another venue can be the educational sector. Our kids. When I put out that program back in 2007, there was the only response to an armed intruder in the schools was putting the school into lockdown. Now, since then, that's evolved, but it's still the primary option that the schools are training on is going into lockdown and trying to keep the bad guy out of the school. But after the Parkland shooting, we realized that we needed to educate the kids at an age appropriate level on the same types of principles on both preventing violence as well as responding in violence. And so we put out a program called Beyond Lockdown after the Parkland school shooting that really is the first program designed to train kids 7th grade to 12th grade and even into college sector on how to recognize the red flags that somebody could be progressing towards violence, because people don't just snap, there's always a progression, and then what to do if it happens. So, and in fact, I'd be happy to provide a link to that video when we're all done here if you'd like to see it, because it's a program that is designed not just how to help the students and parents and teachers understand the pathway to violence against becoming an active shooter, but also a lot of same indicators are there if they're progressing towards violence against themselves. And school shootings are increasing, but they don't happen that much statistically. But teen suicide's off the chart, and major depression in our kids is off the chart, particularly coming out of the lockdowns. So that's kind of a long-winded way to say how we got here. But when we talk about, putting a framework around what we're going to share with y'all over the next 20, 30 minutes, it really is through the lens of this is a societal issue. And we want to build resiliency at the individual level so that you're building resiliency in the families, and you build resiliency in the families, in the communities, and then in our workforce, in our churches, but it starts at the individual. So that's what we're trying to do, is reach down to educating, preparing individual kids, individual adults and families so that they are just become stakeholders in their own safety and security. So,
Randy, I think we'd like to start the forum today talking about the requirements. We know at the center that regardless of the venue, and you've mentioned several venues, you've mentioned schools, you've mentioned churches, we certainly mentioned the workplace more than once. But we know that regardless of the venue, there are some key ingredients that we need in order to create a valid, viable, healthy violence prevention plan. Would you speak to that for a moment?
Yeah, you bet. So in the workforce, the concept of workplace violence prevention has been around for, good 30 years, following some of the mandates for sexual harassment training and, prevention of sexual harassment and inappropriate behavior in the workplace, workplace violence. As you start to see more and more incidents occur, then it's become more and more of a mandate, both from OSHA as well as other types of oversight or compliance type of documents and organizations. So the two big ones are OSHA, which has stated that having a workplace violence or violence prevention program in your organization, if you have employees and they would fall under the Department of Labor regulations, workplace violence is part of that. And so it's not an option. In fact, there's directives out there that if a workplace shooting happens, or a significant incident occurs or violence occurs in the workplace, OSHA will send their investigators into the workspaces to assess What kind of program did they have? Did it line up with prevailing standards, with the actual OSHA documents? They highlight two sectors in particular being higher risk than others, one being healthcare and the other being retail organizations. But it applies across the board. And so what happens is that if OSHA comes in and say writes a report and finds a company or an organization for not having a program, then the fine, nobody wants a fine from OSHA or write-up from OSHA, but it can set up from a legal side, and we'll talk more about this in just a moment, but the civil liability to the organization, and that civil liability can be dramatic, both on the impact on financially as well as on the organization itself. So the other document that really is being used to provide architecture and what needs to be in place is there's a national, really it's an international standard on workplace violence from ASIS. And inside that document, it provides an overview of how do you set up a comprehensive violence prevention program, from policies to awareness training for all the employees, to enhanced training for managers and supervisors, to establishing and formalizing and training a threat assessment or threat management team, up to the senior leadership of the organization. And again, this isn't just a corporate issue. It certainly applies to corporations, but if it's any workforce in an organizational structure that it falls under OSHA regulations, these standards are going to be there. And so, to just kind of give you a little bit of a deeper dive on how that hierarchy breaks out, the policies is where it starts. And so we would define, what is workplace violence, who owns that process within an organization. Typically, that's going to be either security or human resources. Occasionally, it'll be in the risk management and compliance side of the organization. But I would say probably 95% of the time, the violence prevention program in an organization, and this is true again, whether it's a ministry or educational institution, or a nonprofit organization or a corporation or a government agency, is going to be HR or security. And so the policy is going to serve as a framework to say what is acceptable behavior in our organization, who owns this process, what are the reporting procedures if somebody has a concern, and it really just kind of lays out the architecture for what needs to be in place related to that program. And then you're going to have, and what the ASIS standard highlights is different levels of training, because at the end of the day, see something, say something, you're trying to educate people on what is workplace violence and what is the process that people go down to become violent, so you can try and prevent it. That's the ultimate goal. And so there's different levels of training, and it starts with awareness training. And so that awareness training is going to cover 5 key areas. And this is something that all the employees need to be trained on. It's not just, sometimes you'll say, okay, you'll talk with organizations that say, we're going to train our security managers on the principles of workplace violence. Well, that's not enough. That's not enough to not get litigation filed against you and fine, because it requires everybody in the organization to be trained. It's another reason why I'm not a real fan of just providing an option of training, but not mandating it and tracking it. Because if you had an incident and you just had a video that was up on the website that maybe people know about or maybe they don't, that kind of opens up, I think, makes the organization vulnerable. So that awareness training needs to cover 5 areas. It needs to cover what is workplace violence, how do you define it? And that's important because a lot of people understand that if somebody comes in with a gun, okay, that's an active shooter, that's workplace violence. But they don't realize that workplace violence incidents as a whole, when you understand how broad the definition is, happens over 2 million incidents a year that are reported and cost companies in the United States over $120 billion a year. So that's an expensive proposition. So people need to understand what is workplace violence. and how do we define it? Then they need to understand what are the red flags that somebody could be progressing towards violence. What are the behavioral indicators? And one of the myths about workplace violence is that people just snap. Well, that's not true. It's whether it's a school shooting or a workplace shooting, there are almost always red flags that are communicated, that are stated, or threats that are made, or are posts on Facebook or Twitter. There are these indicators that somebody is progressing towards where they could become violent. And so it's important, because if you address those early on, then you can try and prevent the process from happening. So the third area is when if an employee sees those red flags, who do they report it to? And how is it the supervisor? Is it HR? Is it, do you have an anonymous hotline? The different ways that they can let somebody know without feeling that they're going to have retribution against them for reporting it, and they feel willing to come forward. So that's the third area. The fourth area, and this is a sensitive area, but it's critical, is the area of intimate partner or domestic violence, as it could be affecting the workplace. And the reason that's in there is because about a third of workplace shootings are coming out of a bad relationship at home. And so when the person that's being abused said, I've had enough, and they leave the relationship, now the abuser, he doesn't know, and I say he, it's not always men perpetrating against women, it can be the other way around. It could be in same-sex relationships, but predominantly it's men perpetrating violence against a woman. And when she's had enough and she says, I'm leaving this abusive relationship, now he doesn't know where she lives, but he knows where she works. And what that can do is put the bullseye right on the workplace. Another environment that can be at increased risk with this issue of domestic violence is our churches, because now he doesn't know where she lives, but he knows where she goes to church. And so the abuser can show up either looking for the kids or looking for his abused partner in that house of worship environment. So again, it's not just a workplace. So that's 4 of the 5. And then the 5th area that's required is how to respond in an extreme violence situation like active shooter. So 4 of the 5 are all around prevention. And that's why I'm not a fan of just having a run, hide, fight video and say, you've got a violence prevention program. That's really reacting, not preventing. And so the majority of this violence prevention program is all around an understanding the myths, understanding the roadblocks to participating. In fact, the saying, see something, say something. Well, who do I say something to? What is it that I'm looking to see? I was on the Metro in DC a couple of weeks ago, and they've condensed that down now on the Metro. It's from see something, say something to see it, say it. That's their new term. And so, and you want to get people to become stakeholders, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is help people that are having a hard time. And there's a lot of people that are in a distressed state coming out of COVID, with all the, the political strain, economic strain, health issues, supply chain issues, inflation, war around the world. All that is just, they're stressors. And so we want to educate people on how can we help them and prevent violence from happening. So that's awareness training. And then there's 3 other levels, manager and supervisor or leadership training. And this usually, when you're talking about larger organizations, is the biggest gap. In other words, they may have a policy, they may have trained some of their people or all their people on what to look for, but then when they report it to their supervisor, that supervisor has not had appropriate training on how to do one of 2 things. Either recognize that what's being reported to me is enough of a red flag that I need to push it up higher to the threat assessment or threat management team, or they're not trained on how to intervene with the person that's in that distress state and make it better. In other words, they don't have good, solid verbal de-escalation skills. In fact, they probably have the opposite. They're kind of clueless or reckless, and they go in there and are a crummy listener, and they take somebody that's already upset and they push them at a higher level because of poor training and understanding. So that's really a critical component when we talk about a holistic violence prevention program, is that manager supervisor level. And honestly, when I'm dealing with a Fortune 100 company or a federal agency that has 250,000 employees, that's usually not in place, at least not very well. And I know Dan sees that in the faith-based organizations quite a bit as well. And That's a really important skill set to learn and to train on. Then the fourth component would be the threat assessment team. And in that standard, it says you must have a threat assessment team, multidisciplinary team, and you must train them initially and periodically. So typically, in fact, Dan and I just got done working with our partner, Dave Benson, for one of the largest ministries in the US, doing threat assessment team training. And they brought in their risk manager, their compliance guy, their security director, their HR leadership, and then various components of the ministry to sit around the table, because they get threats all the time, and say, okay, here's what's coming at us. This is a letter that was mailed. Here was a voicemail. Here's an issue we're having with an employee. And how do we keep this in the threat assessment and violence prevention and not cross over into crisis management where we have a real problem? So that really sits right in there at that threat assessment team training. So that's a required level. And then the top level, that would be the leadership of the organization. And that's an important one because you don't spend hours with the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, but you do want to educate enough so that they understand. In fact, this is interesting. What I've seen happen over the last couple of years more than ever is the board of directors or the C-suite now coming down to the security department and asking, what are we doing to protect our employees from this issue of violence, and particularly active shooter, because they see it happening in the news over and over and over and over. And it's just kind of broken through the psyche of the average person to where it used to be kind of an issue on the fringe. Not anymore. In fact, the American Psychological Association, right before COVID, they do a study every year saying what's stressing out Americans the most. The number one source of anxiety and stress on the average American citizen was active shooter situations in society. So, that's just kind of lingering there in the back of their psyche. So that's there for the organizational leadership. So now they want to know, okay, how do we prevent this? What are we doing to protect our employees? I had the CEO, I was doing a meeting before we were kicking off training for one of Warren Buffett's companies a couple of years ago. And he looked at me and said, I, as a CEO, recognize how much violence is going on. In fact, I had an incident happen as I was driving the other day. And I said to myself, he said, this is the CEO talking to me. He said, I said to myself, if I knew that there were things that I could do to equip my people to try and prevent violence from happening, and I didn't do it, and we had an incident, he said, I just couldn't live with myself. And so, that's the CEO level, saying I'm responsible for my people, and this is a foreseeable risk. And, that's usually at that level, it's not the primary focus, but there also is a liability issue. And now even an increased financial issue that we'll talk about in a second that will come if you don't have a proper program in place with those different levels: policy, awareness training, manager training, threat assessment team training, and senior leadership training, all around this issue of how do we keep our workplace safe. One thing I know that we were going to talk about, and this might just be a good segue into this, since I've been talking for so long, maybe you can talk about how that architecture gets tailored for, say, a church environment, because we're just releasing our Safe Church program that has a similar but modified approach on how do we build resiliency in the individuals in that church environment. Maybe you could talk how that architecture that I just described gets modified and enhanced for a church, or it doesn't have to be a church, it could be any house of worship.
Absolutely. Thank you, Randy. I'll be happy to. The one thing that we realized when we began to work with the church, with houses of worship, perhaps is a better term in general, is we began to realize that there are two somewhat discretely different organizations within that environment. You have the staff that is actually a normal organization, company, corporation, what have you, that is organized and working on an everyday basis. So it becomes very similar to any workplace violence. But then you have an entirely separate group called the congregants. We have the people that are coming in, gathering on a Sunday. We have smaller groups that may be gathering from time to time during the week. We have the youth organizations and that sort of thing. What we did is we took the corporate guidance where we used 5 tiers and we pared it down to 4 tiers The first tier is very similar to what we would do for any corporation, but we designed what we called a vulnerability assessment. A vulnerability assessment, it literally reviews all of safety, and it goes into things like how do we vet our volunteers? We know that people mean well, but how do we make sure that the volunteer that's working with the children is in fact allowed to be with children? How do we make sure that the volunteers working with our youth likewise are allowed to be with youth, and so on it goes, as well as some of the physical building vulnerabilities and that sort of thing. We also give them some guidance. Most of them have not had a chance to see governance documents and policies and procedures and that sort of thing that would come out of typically the corporate environment. So we help with that as well. Tier 2, what we do, the area where we talked about workplace violence awareness, we teach more of a broad situational awareness. What we want to do is we want to help equip everybody to take it out of the church environment. We talk about safety in the church, situational awareness in the church, the same basic behavior patterns and concerns of behavior that you would look for in everywhere that you are, really. But in the work environment, we have people that we deal with 9 to 5 every day. So perhaps we know personalities and that sort of thing a little bit better. In the church environment, we simply frame that reference a little bit differently. And also, we want to be on the lookout for people coming into the church environment that may be hurting. We talk about people, we want them to come into a house of worship, and they may be burdened with some challenges in life, domestic violence. It may be, a de-escalation is a somewhat of a learned skill for most of us. It's understanding how to work with heated encounters and bring them down. But we also want to understand when we need to trade off the situation where we're not dealing with it by ourselves, which becomes the next layer. We have introduced threat assessment to what we call our safe church program and our safe worship program, soon to be released as well. We want to help, whether it's a group of 3, or as Randy mentioned, with this large ministry, it's actually a group of 13 different individuals coming from different aspects of their workplace, as well as different volunteer aspects of the congregational side, come together and understand what is a viable threat, what is a real threat. Do these people have access to weapons? Were they simply having a bad day and they said some things that were inappropriate, maybe shouldn't have been said, hot-headed moment, whatever you want to call it, but is it an actual threat? And we train them in how to assess that, how to look at that, and then also how to some thought processes on how to mitigate those particular threats. We simply take it and reframe it a little bit and work for the church congregation. And again, especially at the threat assessment level, that is bringing together a group from the staff as well as a group from the volunteer congregational level.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate you kind of walking folks through how the same lens and framework can be applied to another venue. Because
absolutely,
when we talk about safe schools, it's a similar process where you're going to train everybody from the students and parents. I'm not aware. I'm sure it's out there, but I'm not aware of a program that's really designed to speak to the student and the parents and the families on this whole violence prevention cycle. Clearly, more and more schools are having threat assessment teams and are training into the active shooter area, but really having a good understanding of how kids in a distressed state progress towards either taking themselves out or others along the way. And what can be done and what's the role of social media in that. And, it's a real need out there, but it's a similar architecture. It's a similar structure that has been pulled now from, the corporate side and applied to that venue, just like Dan mentioned for houses of worship.
Excellent. Excellent. It's interesting, isn't it, Randy, how it, excuse me, how it does apply. It really applies across the board. It's simply a matter of looking at what the organizational structure is and what is the best fit for how it would work within that organization.
Yeah, exactly right. And again, the end state of that is, sometimes I'm doing media interviews and say, well, doesn't this training just kind of peddle fear, or doesn't it just increase anxiety? And I said, no, it does the exact opposite. What people have is they have the fear and anxiety already, because they turn on the news, they see this happening all over the country, and shopping malls and Walmart and grocery stores, and it's like our parents are nervous to send their kids off to college because, what's going to happen to my kids when they go out there? But through the training, it's really the only way, because see what happens is if people are in that anxiety state for long enough and don't feel like they can do anything about it, they start to feel helpless. In fact, there was a whole learning ideology or concept in the DoD training called learned helplessness. Basically, get conditioned to feel helpless. But what can happen is if they feel helpless long enough, and like there's just nothing I can do about it, and I never will, then they go from helpless to hopeless. And it's when people cross into that 8th stage of hopelessness that bad things happen, addictions and escape behaviors, and with the ultimate escape being taking themselves out. And so the training and education really is the inoculation, if you will, or the antidote to that fear and anxiety, because they have an understanding on what I can do and what my role is. And I don't just feel like I'm susceptible to whatever happens to me. And that's the empowerment level that increases resiliency. And the more people in your organization that are empowered, the more resilient the organization. And, actually you make an organization more of a hard target than a soft target.
Randy, that's so very well said. And that kind of makes a good segue into another topic that I think we'd like to mention today. Randy, we've seen a record increase in the violent events coming out of COVID, certainly during lockdown and that sort of thing. Any thoughts on why the sudden increase? What's going on? We've kind of spoken to that a little bit, but maybe touch on that a little bit further and help us understand why is the incline constantly going up?
Yeah, I think it's multifaceted, but if you look at some of the research and some of the studies on just the kind of the mental state of people in America prior to COVID, it wasn't in a good place. You had record levels of teens in what they call a major depressive disorder. You had lots of even adults in the same area. And I think that there's a lot of people that are just feeling kind of helpless. And then you add on more stressors like the pandemic, more stressors like financial issues. You see political polarities probably as significant as they ever have been. It's just another issue. It's another factor that causes people anxiety and stress. And you put almost anybody under enough stress, and you're going to start to see behaviors. And so without dealing with the stressors, you have this piling on effect. And even the Surgeon General came out not too long ago and says, the primary issue in health in America right now is mental health. And so I think that's a component. The FBI reported the murder rate in 2020 had a 30% increase. Major assaults, aggravated assaults, 12%. These were some of the highest increases they had seen since they've been statistically, keeping track of these kind of things. So I think what you're seeing is that piling on effect, and then there's a component of law enforcement. As kind of the pendulum swings back and forth sometimes, but I know I've talked to people in law enforcement. They're saying, there's not the level of support out there that we used to have to try and prevent certain types of crimes. And so we're more in the reactionary level than the prevention side. And unless it hits a certain threshold, we really don't get involved because either of reduced resources or just a sense that I'm not sure the top cover's there. And so we're gonna, we're still gonna do our jobs to the best we can, but there's not that proactive stance that maybe it was before they felt a little less coverage from a law enforcement perspective. So I think you combine all those things together and you see crime increasing, you see these active shooter incidents increasing, and people are looking for answers. And because of that, almost growing intolerance for this is what leads into the next issue, Dan. I think our last one we had was to talk about the financial impact of this.
Yes.
So one of the things that we've been doing over the years is because if you're dealing with a company or any kind of organization, the finances and financial impact of these incidents is a real issue. I was involved in a court case in San Diego probably 12 years ago, and it was a workplace shooting in which a guy that worked there for a number of years, for some reason, he started acting really weird about 30 days before the incident occurred, and he'd worked there for a number of years effectively, but he all of a sudden, I don't know if he went off his meds or what, but he started making threatening statements to his coworkers. He said, "I think you're out to get my job from me. I think you're going behind my back and talking to the supervisor." He would walk around and take his hand and kind of like a gun pointed at the base of their back and say, "Am I scaring you?" And just bizarre behaviors. But this bus company in San Diego didn't have any program in place. And so one night, this guy, he walks into the supervisor's office, pulls out a gun, gets into an argument with the two supervisors, and winds up shooting and killing two of them. So the court case afterwards, they brought me in and I said, what we want to know is, could this incident have been prevented at the end of the day? And you never know for sure. But the standard they were looking for was a term called, is it more likely than not that this thing could have been prevented? Well, they didn't have any program in place. People saw red flags. They had no training on what to do. And for 30 days, there was red flag, red flag, red flag, red flag. And so at the end of the day, it was my assessment that, this could have been prevented more likely than not if they had had a program in place and people knew what to do. So what the outcome of that was, it was in the depositions and going through all this, and they was just getting ready to go to court, and they wound up settling for about $5 million with one of the families, basically saying they were negligent. It was foreseeable risk. They had opportunities, and because they didn't, now here's $5 million payout. Well, fast forward now to the environment that we're in right now, and in the last 6 to 8 months, you've seen some of the financial liability to these violent incidents increasing. And I'll just give you a quick, we can dig deeper dive into any one of these, but Parkland school shooting, the Department of Justice agreed. It's not like they're negotiating. They agreed to pay, I think it was around 120 some odd million dollars to the families of Parkland because of not responding effectively to the red flags that were being reported into, say, some of the hotlines and some of the channels. There wasn't an effective response to that. And so they agreed to pay a significant amount of money. There was a shooting down in San Antonio, Texas at a church a few years ago. One of the worst shootings in Texas history, killed 26 people. But the guy was a former Air Force guy. And he was kicked out of the Air Force because of domestic violence issues. Things that, if had been reported to the law enforcement agencies, would have prevented him from getting access, or at least through legal channels, getting access to an assault weapon that he used in the shooting. Well, that led to a judge ordering the Air Force to pay, I think it was around $230 million. The Uvalde, horrible incident in Uvalde, and we don't even talk about all the details of that. Clearly, some things not done properly. The class action suit just filed a couple of weeks ago, $27 billion against those involved. And then another one that just, because it's one thing to have a lawsuit and then have charges or penalties, but it's what do they actually wind up paying? In the court case I was in, it's $5 million. Well, there's an issue, an incident just happened a few months ago in Dallas, Texas, where Spectrum TV, they had one of their workers that they didn't do a good background checks and hiring process. And then it looks like in the incident, what it was is a guy that worked for Spectrum, a TV technician. He showed up at a woman's house. And then the next day when he was off duty, he wore his uniform again and grabbed the vehicle, Spectrum TV vehicle, showed up in her house again. She didn't know. And he wound up robbing her and killing her. Well, then there was things that were signed and fraudulent activity afterwards where Spectrum was trying to cover up. Well, the jury recommended damages of over $7 billion in this incident because of the lack of diligence on the part of Spectrum TV. And what just was agreed to by Spectrum TV and the family 2 days ago was a payment of $1.1 billion. That's unheard of. And you deal with a large corporation, they say, well, we can absorb $1 million. I mean, it's not good, but it's not going to cause us much issue. $1 billion is a different case. So, and the reason, this is my point, is that I think there is this sense of aggravation and intolerance among people, the average citizen, that says, we got to do something. We cannot let this continue to happen. And so when they have that opportunity, i.e. sitting on a jury stand, and they see these incidents, they see negligence, particularly if it's like a criminal negligence, then they're just letting it go and going for whatever they possibly can do to put the damages in. So this is a totally new ballgame, in the hundreds of millions and billions of dollars is tied to violence incidents on the organizational liability. We never seen anything like that. So anyway, I wanted to highlight that because that's a new thing that's happening, and organizations need to know that. They need to know here's the part of that exposure. It makes it even more important, not just the right thing to do, but it's just from a liability side, it's a smart thing to do. Well, Dan, I think that takes us to that 10-minute level for Q&A, if I remember right.
Yeah, that's right. We really appreciate this. I think we could go on for a couple hours and still have plenty more to talk about even after that. This has been very, very informative, and we appreciate
You're welcome.
What the two of you have really enlightened us all about. I've got one question to start with, and then there's one in chat I'll ask. But how do you overcome the resistance that organizations, whether they're businesses, churches, schools, universities, have about an outside group or consultant or a group like yours coming in when they have their own security presence within the organization? They have in a church, it might be, we've got old Fred who's a retired military this or police that, and he looks things over and we feel pretty good that we're doing okay. I mean, that's a constant thing. I think everybody in this business hears that, they got people inside that do this all the time. We're good. We've got everything under control, and understanding the importance of the fresh eyes, coming in with fresh eyes, you see things totally different that people internally don't see. But I'm sure you guys come up with that or encounter that a lot. How do you overcome that, particularly in this environment that we're in these days, to help people realize they need outside consulting and help on these kind of issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll give you a couple thoughts and then have Dan add in his perspective. What I've seen over the years in dealing with pushback, like initially after Virginia Tech and we first put out the shots fired video, part of the pushback had to do not so much with just bringing somebody in from the outside, but not wanting to scare people. So we don't want to talk about active shooter. I mean, that doesn't happen here. And we don't want to either scare people by bringing up the topic or potentially open us up to liability because we told somebody what to do and they did it and didn't work out. And so now we're afraid of being liable for telling somebody what to do in an active shooter situation. So one of the things that we used to deal with that pushback is just to ask a couple of simple questions about, okay, what do you have in place with the given people that you have? So if Fred's there, and I mean, do you have a holistic violence prevention program that educates and trains everybody from your youth group to your adult ministry to the executives on how to keep our place holistically safe on an individual level? 99.9% of the time, the answer is no. And we may have somebody that, may have a security team. We may have a retired police officer or an off-duty officer with a car sitting in front of the church on a Sunday morning. That's all good. but normally they don't have a holistic approach. And when they see that pyramid or they see that 5-tier approach, and that's how we start our presentation. Here's the cover of the puzzle box. Here's what it ought to look like. And you may have some components, and maybe Fred's doing really well at 2 of the 5. But if you don't, here's how we can help fill in the 5. And it's the same thing again with a Fortune 50 company. You know, you've got your corporate security team and you've got your own sometimes law enforcement force in the corporation. But does Sally at the front desk in the C-suite have understanding of what to do if she gets a threat? Or here's something, how do I respond to this and who do I let know? So that's usually just approaching it from here's what the whole package looks like. I even said, you may not need this or all these components, but when they look at it and get an understanding, all you're getting, get wisdom. It's the most important thing. Then they're able to say, okay, here's the whole picture. Yeah, we don't have this. And so then usually there's not pushback. But if I just approach them, and this is how we started out, we just had an active shooter video. It's just a random active shooter video. It's like, well, where does this fit in the big picture? How does this really equip us organizationally, holistically? And so now when we approach an organization, we say, let us walk you, here's what's the requirements, here's the liability exposure if you don't have it, here's a couple of case studies, and here's the picture of what the whole thing looks like. Then I just don't have anybody hardly ever say that doesn't make sense. Sometimes they may say, I don't have budget for it. Or, you know, we can only do 2 of these 5 right now because that's all the resources we have. But even that, if you get up to the leadership, if you get up to the senior leadership in most organizations, I mean, they have the ability and the resources to do it if they want to. And that's where it really comes into an understanding of what this does for the organization. And it's not a hit on Fred. It's just saying, here's how we can augment Fred. Here's how Fred fits in this whole picture. And typically that'll help with the pushback. Dan, what else would you add to that?
It's really Randy deals with this in the corporate world as much as he does in the house of worship world. The very subtle differences that I see in the house of worship world is not considering the different types of threats. So to go along with the analogy, if Fred is at the front door and Fred is armed or not armed or what have you, but it's Fred's job to take out something that looks like a threat coming in, that's covering one area. That's not holistic. What about the threats within the congregation? And especially, you know, almost every congregation is streaming right now. There are cameras present. It's not just everybody with a cell phone, you know, pressing up the video. We have live video going on now. In fact, at the last church shooting, I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, and at the last church shooting here in Saginaw, the church surveillance system, the videos were actually posted to YouTube afterwards, and you could pretty much see everything that went on. And the question is, when someone disrupts a service, for example, what are those proper procedures? Have they thought that through? Are we simply going to do a takedown? Are we simply going to, you know, make a big scene, if you will, right in front of all the cameras? Not too long ago, obviously a very heated issue within the church environment, church community right now is the abortion issue. And we had people show up in very, very large churches that were very passionate about their feelings on abortion, and it differed from that particular churches. And they did stand up in the middle of a national broadcast and begin their protest and had to do with clothing coming off and that sort of thing. What is the best way to deal with that? And those are the kind of discussions that we normally have in the faith-based environment with the pastors and the security team. We also want to make sure that they understand if someone in the youth group begins to explore cutting themselves or something like that, Fred may not have all the appropriate skills to deal with that as a threat. Therefore, we want to help them. We want to augment everything that Fred is doing and be more holistic. What are the different types of threats that we're looking for and that we're training on?
Very good. I have one more question, then we'll go to the open format and let folks just talk amongst themselves and you all as well. The question is, do you ask the house of worship to perform their own vulnerability assessment just as a quarterly or routine self-check?
We have created a vulnerability assessment that we believe is an excellent assessment to use either with the vulnerability assessment that most of the insurance companies provide to the church to go through, or to do it separately. It doesn't matter. Our recommendation is to go through it the first time. Let us at least look at it and evaluate it and help them figure out what the vulnerabilities actually look like. There are many times when maybe relative to lighting in the parking lot or something like that, they don't, that involves thousands of dollars and they don't necessarily have the funding. Well, there are ways perhaps that we can work around that. It's simply a statement on an assessment that needs to be worked through, if that makes sense. We also invite them to go back through and see where they're at in 6 months to a year. At a bare minimum, annually, check your own progress. If this is where you started out, great. What have you improved on? What still needs to be improved on?
Let's see, I'm looking one more time. Yeah, that's very good. Thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead based on time and what we said we were going to do. I want to thank again Randy and Dan for taking the time today for this fantastic discussion. And they're going to stick around for a few minutes, I hope. We're going to go to the open forum format where individuals can talk amongst themselves or ask you direct questions. And we'll just go with that until people are needing to leave. But for those that signed on for the hour, we're done with that part, and we'll go to the open forum now. Rick, you can go ahead and proceed to unmute or whatever. But this was really good, and I really appreciate you all being with Counter Threat Group today to talk about this. I think it's a topic we're probably going to have you back for because there's so many different elements that we can talk about regarding to all this. So
you're welcome. Well, thank you for the opportunity to visit with yourselves and the team.
Absolutely. Yep. Thanks so much for having us.
Okay. Do any of y'all would like to just ask them any questions just on your own? That's absolutely fine at this point.
There's a couple of other things in the chat, Doug, if you want to read that real quick. I don't know if you can sit from your end.
Yeah, I say that we got some good chat comments. One question I guess I'm seeing is I'm not hearing any reference to CPTED assessments. Any thoughts? You guys have any thoughts on that?
I'm a fan of CPTED. I think CPTED is great. I think the concept of CPTED, as we all know, in the consulting world, we have to be careful whose material we use. But I think that CPTED has actually written a very good thought process about what proper landscape architecture, if you will, should look like, and lighting and that sort of thing. I think they do an excellent job. They've set a standard.
I saw one interesting comment here from a gentleman from Department of Justice saying, that sounds like a good resource. It says, my agency, Department of Justice, has developed a victim-based strata matrix assessment tool for adolescent, adult, elderly, et cetera, because our behavioral unit analytics bear out time and again that there is just no one-size-fits-all preparation protocol across diverse demographic groups and their unique vulnerability metrics. Yeah, that would be a good tool to make available to the folks. What I found is that there's a lot of resources at DHS and FEMA and checklists and workbooks. FBI has some greats, and so does Secret Service. What often is a gap is a way of getting that out to the masses in a way where they know now how to use it. So there's a lot of tools, and this sounds like a great one. But now in a simple way, 15 minutes, somebody can watch a video, or they go through an e-learning course, and they have the takeaway tools enough to be able to then go back in and use some of the more in-depth items that like we're talking about here. But I think that's great.
Sometimes those gaps, Randy, occur in not just corporate, but also houses of worship. There's a lot of good information available. but it requires us as security professionals to fill that gap. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, we're kind of like the translators. How do we take these tools and help translate them in a way that the average person can get value out of, whether it's education or a tool like an analytic. And then, again, the ultimate goal is build resiliency and making ourselves and our churches or our schools harder targets. And I remember after Sandy Hook, and there was a well-meaning for the most part, but there was a big task force put out by the White House on 15 actions that we're going to take to try and prevent school shootings anymore. Well, about 14 of the 15, I remember talking to some people on Capitol Hill. I said, 14 of the 15 were very politicized, and all around gun control for the most part, but the issue of training and equipping people is apolitical. It plays on both sides of the aisle. So when we're doing how do we keep our kids safe? How do we keep our families safe? How do we keep our churches safe? And educating people on that resiliency, those principles, there's just not a lot of pushback. I don't care if I'm talking to the Democrats or the Republicans, everybody seems to agree on that. So that's where I like to focus, because it doesn't get politicized. I saw a statement or a question about, just somebody at the front door with a gun, and depending on what state you're in and what county and the proficiency and the training and, and even the environment, the statement, the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Well, sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's not. And we can give case study after case study that proves that. So it's getting out of the politicalization of violence and getting into practical, real tools that prevent and help people survive. It happens.
I would agree. I would echo the same thing. In fact, I was going to make a similar comment about, all the forums that are talking about just arm somebody. I realize it's a very complex discussion, and I'm a master instructor in the firearms industry. I'm not against that, but that's not holistic. That's simply, and I think that we address that, we want to augment Fred. I'm not saying get rid of Fred, and neither did Randy, but we're saying that's not holistic. And even if we have the best Fred in the world at the front door, multiple eyes looking for threats because they're stakeholders in their own safety has got to be the answer at the end of the day.
Where do you on the whole liability issue that you addressed about the huge awards that are being made for some of these incidences where people are getting fed up and they're just making these awards? At what point when you're talking on probably a smaller scale with small companies and houses of worship or whatever that all have to have liability insurance, at what point do insurance companies get heavier involved in this whole process and requiring some kind of actual assessment outside of that little bullet point thing that they send churches to, do all this stuff to make sure you're meeting the goals? Because insurance companies do not want to make payouts, and what
Right.
they provide is not going to prevent them from making payouts. So there's got to be something out different than what's being done now to really do everything you can do to significantly reduce the risk of bad things happening in churches and houses of worship and schools, all those. At what point do insurance companies start taking a different stance on this? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
That's a good question. I'm seeing a little bit where they are taking more proactive stances, and they tend to like certifications. And so that's, when we put together our safe workplace certification, doesn't mean that an incident can't happen in a workspace, but it does mean you've done your due diligence, like sending your kids to driver's ed. So, and insurance companies recognize driver's ed as either a requirement to drive or a reduction in the insurance policies. So I think what you'll begin to see is through recognition of some financial discounts or recognition of lessened liability on the organization, insurance companies taking more and more of a proactive effort in that, and even making requirements. So, but you're also seeing a trend towards legislation making requirements. There's There is legislation sitting right now that's been passed by the House and that's been sitting on the Senate right now being taken up to mandate for healthcare this training across the board, not optional, not even just OSHA directives kind of stuff. It's just, law. And so I think eventually what you're going to see is Capitol Hill is going to put legislation in place for schools. They're going to put legislation in for workforce across the board and, make it illegal, not just liable. So
yeah,
I think you could see that happening.
Randy, if I could touch base on what you just said, the state of Florida, we have a very, very prolific and standard of having school guardians in place, regardless whether it's a public or private school. School guardians obviously are public, and the frustration felt of going to private schools saying you got to get your pieces and the puzzles in place here. Touching base on your statement about standardization, in my learning of the industry, that when you have, let's just take firearms within the church, that the insurance companies have a better tendency to work with those where all of your firearms carrying professionals have standardized training versus somebody in the military from 30 years ago, versus a guy that's a retired top volunteer firefighter that have experience with firearms but no standardized training. I think that I agree that standardized training for everyone within that specific facility, be it faith-based or not, I think that standardized training is an absolute gem and a gold mine, and things they must do.
Yeah. Well said, Kurt. I really see it heading that way. Sorry, I missed you at the booth too. I saw you stop by.
So, gentlemen, I was at the Global Security Conference with Randy and Dan's group there, Cpps, and unfortunately, I just missed Randy by like 10 minutes. All that stinking cup of coffee I just got, ruined the opportunity. But if you gentlemen ever have an opportunity to attend GSX, outstanding conference.
Yeah, it was great to see it come back. We've been there for many years, and last year was pretty, cold start coming back from COVID, but this year was a really good conference.
I was representing, my primary employer, Covenant Security Equipment, bullet and blast resistant products, as you gentlemen are well aware. Also CEN, Christian Emergency Network. So when I'm there, I'm always got my feelers out for a majority of the platforms that I or we represent. So it was a great experience, and I appreciate being a member of this group. I have to tell you that the wisdom portrayed, from years and years, it's very honorable, to say the least. It's not just a bunch of guys like, well, praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. We're all speaking from different elements of education and training levels, but all with the same mindset and cause. And I'm just honored to just stand shoulder to shoulder with each one of you gentlemen and the groupings and the members that attend. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Kurt. Appreciate your support. That's we love having you on here. And the goal is it's about finding best solutions, and
Amen.
I'm trying to use the word, Dan's trying to get me to quit using the word agnostic, but wait, he knows what I mean. We're talking about, we're all on this trying to find the best answer to these problems that confront us. And there's no other overriding goal. So
absolutely.
I think we have excuse me, go ahead.
Go ahead, sir. I was just going to say, and this is not, please understand, this is not to sound vain, self-centered, or a shameless plug, if you will. But when we're talking, and you guys, I know that you have demonstrated some of your colleagues when it comes to bullet-rated, bookshelves on wheels or movable, that type of thing. Guys, I would have to plug Covenant Security Equipment when it's discussing relative bullet blast resistant products for all these facilities. You know, I would love to support you guys in any way possible. And this is one piece of the grand comprehensive puzzle, but I just wanted to make sure that that you guys are aware that I'm here saying, hey, help in any way necessary.
Thank you so much.